Okay. Let's try this again. So just to begin, so our next area of growth and significant development happens in childhood. And we have childhood kind of divided from infancy, which we're usually talking 0 to about 2 years of age. And then what we consider early childhood goes from about 2 to about 8 years of age. In fact, if anyone's in the early childhood education field, that's the age range that you're usually considering when you're looking at early childhood education. And then we have what middle late childhood from about 8 to puberty. Okay. Now you will probably have noticed that these aren't strict age things. That when we were talking about infancies, there was things that kind of bled over into the early childhood years, and we'll see similar with middle childhood. Because by the age of 8 we're already in elementary school and we're already in the educational processes, so there's a lot of overlap. So these are really kind of almost arbitrary in a lot of ways, just to kind of keep that in mind. But we do recognize there's a distinction between infancy, these early childhood years, and the later childhood years. So, and there's some important differences that we will note. Okay. Just like with infancy, we're going to start off with just some physical development stuff. And so if we look right here, again, when we look at our body as it would be compared to an adult by about the age of about 15 and a half, while we still will see some growth and development, some through around to about the age of 29, early 30s. We recognize it's about around 15 and a half where our body is more proportionate to an adult body, but you'll see that there's still some growth left to do, especially in the torso and the head regions. Okay. As we're growing through our early childhood years, you can see that our our body is starting to conform. We're born with like we said, in infancy, a larger skull area, and chunkier areas in the legs and stuff like that. And then through the early childhood years, our head starts to get smaller and our torso becomes longer, and we start to take on more of a child to adult growth spurt. Okay. We do notice some differences compared to infancy, as physical growth slows down in early childhood. Um, we don't see a lot of growth that occurs, especially when we get into 4, 5, and 6 year olds. It kind of slows during that period. The body proportion changes dramatically, as we can see, as the bones and legs and arms grow at a more rapid space as compared to infancy. Okay. And we're still developing from that proximal distal arrangement, where we're still much of our muscle growth and everything is focused centrally, and it's growing outwardly. So the last areas again that are going to be developing is our more fine motor skills and more balancing in the feet area. Okay. Developmental coordination disorders can be a common thing during this age group. That it means that they're delaying reaching a motor milestone. Can be, but we know that the earlier we catch it with physical education and daily exercise, these kiddos can make up for any developmental growth issues. So, but again, the earlier the intervention, the better the outcome as far as motor growth and any other developmental type of issues that we see during this period of time. Okay. If we look right here, if you've ever taken your child to your pediatrician or something, you probably have seen one of these. It's where you have a weight on one axis and the child's approximate age at another. And the thing that I'd like to focus on for just a moment on this is you'll notice again that growth rates between the age of about 3 to about the age of 6 generally go down. We lose body mass. We lose a lot of the baby fat is the term often used for it. And our growth rate slows during this period. And then at around 7 or 8, it starts to accelerate again. Okay. So it's not uncommon for children between about the age of about 2 to 6 to 7 to become underweighted, to not have as much body mass as they usually do. And sometimes that can concern mom and dads because their child is, it seems like they're almost being almost bulimic or anorexic in their nature. But this is a very normal thing that we see between this age group, is a slowing of growth and body mass and weight. Okay. There are some things that during this age group we can identify that can have both positive and negative effects on children as they're growing physically. We know that during this age group, we have an increase in what's called proprioception. This is our awareness of our body position in space, where we are located. And with that body position, we also start doing a lot of social comparison. Okay. And we become very self aware of body image during this age period. Okay. And as we know that this poor body image in early childhood is what predicts things like anorexia and eating disorders later in childhood as we get into the tween to teen ages. It's this age period between about 2 to 6 and how the child feels about their body as compared to other children and others around them, that body image really starts to take an effect on a child's, in this case, mental and physical well-being. Okay. So when they say, children are exposed to unrealistic body images, this is one age group where parents can kind of thwart some of that by providing them with a good image of their own body and whatnot, which will lead to less social comparison with body image later in childhood and into adolescence. So, Autumn, to your question, does someone make them feel that way? Not necessarily. Yes, so if you're in a family where weight is important and you get shamed for it, yes, of course, that's going to be an aspect of it. But what's happening during this period is something dealing with our physical growth, where we're actually seeing our position and we can see ourselves outside of our internal working. So we see how we're sitting. We feel ourselves in our physical environment. And while we do this, we start to then socially compare our bodies to others. So we might be sitting and we might think, well, why do I sit like that and that person doesn't? Why am I bigger in this space than another child? Now, we don't exactly think that way, but that's kind of what's going on. So yes, part of it can be because mom and dad are saying, oh, you're too big or you're too small or those kinds of things, or other peers or siblings can be doing that. That can be one component of it. But the other component, it goes back to this proprioception, that we start recognizing ourselves in the space that we're in, and we start to do then that social comparison of whether or not we are like other children or unlike other children. Does that make sense? Okay. And then there's always the idea, and we talked a little bit about this when we talked about Sigmund Freud, is do children have a sense of sexuality? Okay. Um, and to answer that question, we have to actually, instead of thinking like adults, we have to think like children. Okay. Children are naturally curious. Children will explore their bodies. And where there is a bundle of nerves that, when touched, give really good feelings, we have the natural propensity to touch those bundles of nerves more. Okay. Not because necessarily that we're having a adult sexual fantasy, but because it feels good. Okay. And again, when I mentioned this again, when we were doing Freud, we can see infants doing this neonatally, even, and doing this exploration. So this is something that is natural. We're trying to learn about our body and different parts of our body and what they do and how they react to touch, to sensations. But is that what we would consider sexuality? Okay, and that's the other part of it. So when we look at this, and let's say we walk in on a child, that our child, and they are touching a erogenous area that has, again, I'm going to put it in more scientific terms, nerve bundles that when stimulated feels good. How should we react? Okay. And this is, again, going back to the body image thing, where if it can create poor body image or shamefulness of the body, dependent upon how the parent reacts to the child. Okay. What we find is that children who end up having a healthy tend to, not always, there's always variability in these, but children who tend to have a positive body image of themselves and not ashamed of their bodies are ones that have parents who, when they come in on and see their child touching an erogenous zone, instead of slapping their hand away and telling them they shouldn't do that, they should be ashamed of what they're doing, they actually create a conversation about what it means to feel that, and who should and who shouldn't, and when is it appropriate. But it's also a good time for a parent to explore their child's health, because you can asking a child who, if someone had taught them to do that, or if someone showed them to do that, then we have a problem. Because this is a good opportunity to see, if the child has been sexually exploited in some way, by not stressing a child out and just having that simple conversation. Okay. And so we do find children who have poor body images about themselves, especially into adolescence and young adulthood, were children where in the family sexuality was not talked about. It was voodoo. It was something that you just didn't experience. Maybe you get the one talk. We find that children that come from those kind of household tend to have the majority of teen pregnancies. They tend to engage in high risk sexual behaviors earlier in life and into adolescence and even pre-adolescent years. And they tend to have a very unhealthy relationship with their body and the use of their body. Okay. But we find that parents who have a open, healthy conversation very early on, that is age appropriate, of course, those children tend to wait longer to engage in sexual activity. They tend to have the lowest rates of teen pregnancy. they tend to have safer sex practices later in adulthood. So this conversation about human sexuality really centers around the parents and caregivers and how comfortable they are about talking about human sexuality and those kind of topics. And again, I always get this in a class when they say, well, how young is too young? And the answer is there's never too young. It's just the conversation has to be appropriate for the child's age. And that's the component of this that tends to get confusing, because we always put these conversations in our adult head instead of realizing what the child is experiencing and bringing that experience down to the child's level instead of our adult level. And so that's some things to consider when thinking about these conversations with your own children, or if you're have young parents as well. So let's, for a little while, because it's during this early childhood years where we can see, I don't want to say it's the most dangerous years of their life, but there is a higher level of mortality during these years, during the early childhood years. And so let's look at some of the risks that we've been monitoring over the years. And I hope that you see some interventions that have been put in place. So motor vehicle deaths have been reduced by about 41%. When we look at playground risks, playground deaths, they've been steadily going down about 19%. Injury due to fire down 45%. But there are two areas, and swimming's down 28%. There are two areas where we're actually seeing an increase in childhood mortality, and that's in poisoning and in suffocation. Okay. If you will notice, in all of these other areas where we've seen a decrease, there's been significant safety increases. So we know the child seats and child restraints. Playgrounds tend to have more safe areas to land and be. We can see that fire safety has been a big issue, and if you live here in Tucson or in the area, you know there's huge campaigns with news medias about swimming safety, especially when swimming season comes on, and putting up fences. But two areas where we haven't seen a huge increase in public awareness or increase in safety education programs or safety is in the area of suffocation and in the area of poisoning, where there's not much guidance of where should we put the bottle of bleach, for example. And in suffocation, what is the appropriate place to set a child? And while we see some increase in public awareness behind these two, they're still lagging behind and are probably the two biggest risks to children through death by accident. Okay. When we look at, and I want to point something out, there's going to be a difference between what we find in research versus what we investigate in reality. And this is prevalence of different types of abuse and neglect among the age group that we're working with between the age of 2 and 6. You will notice that when a survey is given and it's given confidentially, that there's certain types of abuses that we see reported more often than in reality. And the one that I'm going to emphasize here is sexual abuse. We will see here in a minute that reports to, for example, law enforcement or Department of Health and Welfare is much less than what the survey reports that we get are. So when we look at the two most prevalent types of abuses that are reported in a confidential survey, about 48%, we can round it up to 50%, are in the areas of physical and sexual abuse. Okay. The remaining percentages are within the areas of emotional abuse. So this is withholding emotional care from a child. Physical neglect is physical neglect. I'm sorry, I'm blanking for just a minute. Physical neglect is not meeting the physical needs of a child, not necessarily because of abusive reason, but it might be due to family resources, those types of things. And then emotional neglect is uh, denying a child the ability to go to, for example, a healthy preschool or kindergarten, or it can include leaving them alone for long periods of time without any secure base or secure security in a sense. Okay. But when we look at, though, let's look at some different information, though, and let's look at the United States as we compare to 26 modern countries. Okay. Out of the 26 modern countries defined by technology development, as far as the education, legal systems, all of those kinds of things, there's about 26 modern countries. Okay. And of those, the United States, China, and Britain have the worst child welfare and abuse records of the 26 modern countries. Okay. And in fact, if we trace the child welfare movements here in the United States, it would be important to note that here in the United States, abusing animals became illegal before abusing children did. Okay. In fact, once abusing animals became illegal, they became misdemeanors and felonies. It was actually the animal rights people that then went and sought child rights and child welfare rights. And so, just to put that in kind of some historical context, this, as a country, the United States has really lagged in the protection of children when we compare ourselves to other more modern countries. Okay. In fact, I know even Russia has a better child welfare and abuse response than we do. So if you want to think about one of those modern countries that isn't well liked by the United States, they even do better than we do. Okay. Now, when we do compare ourselves to second and third world countries, the United States does okay. The question we should be asking, though, is it appropriate for us to be comparing ourselves to second, third world countries versus the other first world countries that are out there? And that's a question of debate about where we are as citizens here in the United States. Is who is it appropriate for us to model our welfare systems after? So we should note that that's an issue here in the United States, and I think especially among tribal nations and stuff, it's something that is blatantly clear as far as response to especially marginalized individuals here in the United States. Those rates even get worse as we start to think about the communities that tend to be ignored or tend to be overlooked, as you would say. So something to think about when we're thinking about the welfare of our children. Okay. So what about, for example, child maltreatment? Let's dig a little bit deeper into that. You'll remember, and it's important to recognize this, that when we did surveys, these were the rates of physical and sexual abuse. Okay. But when we look at reports to CPS and to the different child welfare systems, there's approximately 6.3 million reports of child abuse each year. Okay. But only half of those actually get investigated for children between the age of 2 and 7. Okay. So of those 6 million cases, the 3 million that are investigated tend to break down like this. You'll see that this has flipped. 78.3% are reports of neglect. Okay. Whereas the other percentage, 18.3 and 9.3, are now in that physical to sexual abuse range. Okay. And then this 8.5, what psychological maltreatment is not meeting the psychological need of children. So it's withholding education from a child. It's not allowing them to have healthy peer relationships. It's any type of maltreatment where you're withholding the ability for a child to psychologically develop. Okay. And usually this is in cases where a parent refuses to allow their child to go to school or doesn't take them to school for very extended periods of time. Okay. And then about 10.6 are experience other types of maltreatment, such as physical maltreatment, such as not having enough nutrition, and those types of different maltreatments. So this is kind of what's occurring in the lived life of children in the United States. And if you could guess, one of the reasons why the United States has such a poor record is there's approximately about 6.3 million reports that are considered valid reports and investigatable. But we only investigate about half of them. Okay. Now, it is important to understand some things about things like maltreatment, except for when we're getting into abuse and neglect, is that sometimes when it comes to these maltreatment numbers, we need to understand that there's social economic drivers that could be driving them. Okay. Such as the ability to afford appropriate food, to be able to transport a child to school. I know right now we have a huge childcare crisis where it's the choice between work and childcare, that you don't barely bring anything home if you work and have a child in childcare all day. So I just want to make sure that we don't just assume that all these children are being severely abused on purpose. There are cases in which the systems that are in place are just not there to support the parents to meet the psychological and physical needs of their children the way they should. And so that is the other component of the United States systems that makes it really hard or for us to really get a grasp on these issues. So I just wanted to make sure that we recognize that not all of the reasons behind these abuses, neglects, and maltreatment are necessarily because it's a bad parent. It's usually a bad system that can create the conditions for which these things can occur. Okay. Okay. And then if we do look at maltreatment and why it's important to consider, these are our fatality rates per day that are attributed to child maltreatment. So I don't have the current numbers. I've been meaning to update these. Maybe I'll get them before we're done with this conversation to review them. But as you can see, they've been on if we were to draw a line, they've been on a steady increase, not a decrease for years. And so what this suggested in 2012 was there were approximately 4.5 children per day passing away from child maltreatment of some type, whether it's starvation, psychological maltreatment, or just abuse or an abuse of some type. Okay. Again, I meant to do this before this. I will get the most current rates so that we can compare to these earlier 2000 years, and so that we can see what are our trends today as far as more recent times. Okay. Now, one thing that I would want everybody to recognize is why in 2000 were we at 3.6, and we've been in a steady increase to where in 2012 we were at 4.5. Okay. And there are again, going back to that other slide, there has been significant changes in response to abuse since 2000. Okay. In 2000, there was from 1990 to the year 2000, there was a huge investment into things like WIC, the food stamp system, the welfare system, that made it so families had easier access to these systems. Okay. And what we saw in 2000 is we started to see the tightening, the drawback on that, and the significant decreases in things like WIC support, and it started to become more difficult to get things like food stamps and welfare benefits. I don't want to use the word benefits, but resources. And we've seen this as a steady increase. And if you can see, the effect of those policies has equaled an increase in death by maltreatment or fatalities by maltreatment. Again, the reason why I bring this up is, again, in that other slide, sometimes maltreatment and abuse does not occur because there are necessarily bad parents, but because the system and the economics that are at play create conditions where children can be maltreated. Okay. Now, when we do look at parent and parent risk, what are some of the predictors, the best predictors of whether a child will be abused and or whatnot? And this is specifically looking at three types of abuse: physical abuse, which is physical harm of a child; sexual abuse; and emotional abuse. Okay, so these are when we look at risk factors, what are the things that tend to be risk factors for the family? Okay. For the mother, we'll separate the two, mother and father, and then we'll look at the relationships between mothers and fathers. The biggest risk for a child based on mother's situation is mothers who have a child born that is born to them between the age of 18 to 23. Okay. And again, we have to ask, well, why, what is it about being that age that puts a child at higher risk of abuse? And we can talk about various things, such as lack of resources, lack of support, lack of even maturity on the parents' end, not just the mother's, but the father's end. Okay. There has been a lot of studies. Unfortunately, funding has dried up in a lot of them. But I'm going to bring up a program that was done in Hawaii, and I still believe they do that. But in the late 80s and 90s, Hawaii had the highest child maltreatment rates and abuse rates in the nation. I mean, they were almost double to the next state lower to them. Okay. And in trying to figure out why, they started what's called a nursing home program. Okay. Which is, if a mother showed up to a hospital between about the age of 18 to about the age of 23, or younger, of course, they would be assigned a nurse home caregiver. Okay. And for the first several months of the infant's development, the nurse would go to the house about once a week and take their weight, do all those kinds of things. But they would also teach parenting skills to the mother. Okay. And then they would follow the child up to about the age of 2. So about the first 6 months, it would be weekly. Then another period, it would be about biweekly, and then about monthly around the age of 1 to the age of 2. Okay. And by doing this program, Hawaii actually reduced their child abuse rates to where today they actually have some of the lowest child abuse rates in the nation. Okay. And there's been other programs that have been tried to model it. So here in the state of Arizona, we have something called Parents as Teachers programs that follow young families in programs like that. That the goal is to go in and help parents learn parenting skills and parenting processes, but also be there as a source of support for especially young families. Okay. So that's an example of mother risk factors, and it seems to be just this age that tends to be the larger predictor. We can look at the way the mother was raised. We could look at whether it's a single mother. We could look at all of those different factors, and this one is the one that tends to still be the higher predictor than even how the mother was raised and those types of factors. Okay. Father risk factors. The biggest predictor of child abuse is the absence of a father figure in the family system. So this could be the father who's never around, or if there are around, it's like they don't exist. I kind of think of the stereotype of some of young dads who come home and they play video games all night after work and do nothing else. Okay. And we do find, again, in that kind of situation, that does set up absent fathering and does set up the risk for abuse in the family system. Okay. And so it can be a psychologically and physically absent father that's in the home, or it can be an absent father who's just not in the home and is non-existent. Okay. And again, this tends to be the biggest predictor on just the father variable. Okay. Now, what about both mom and dad? Now, there's kind of a list of these things for mother and father predictors. Okay. One is stability of relationships. And this is not only if the parents are together and they're partners or married, but when they are separated, if they are separated and in their own two lives, if there's a stability of communication between parents, that tends to be a predictor. Okay. Toxic, you'll notice that we have toxic intimate relationships and we have toxic mother and father relationships. What we mean by toxic intimate relationships is if the parents are not together and they have boyfriends or girlfriends or other new partners in their life, if there's abuse or constant arguing or constant tension in the home, that tends to predict these rates going higher. Okay. Now, if the parents are together and they have toxicity, then that would fit this category as well. Okay. Now, I want to explain toxicity between mother and father. Okay. You can have, let's say, two separated parents, and they can be in healthy relationships with other individuals, and they could be in a very loving home. Okay. But if there's constant arguing and toxicity between the mother and father, that can have the same effect of having that toxicity within the home. Okay. The next one is stability of situation. So you can think of this as constantly moving around, constantly needing to change locations or change homes. So that's kind of the stability of situation. This has mainly been looked at dealing with military families. We find that the more times that the military personnel are transferred to a different location, if they have young children, that tends to be associated with higher rates of abuse within that family. Okay. Response to stress and change. So life is stressful. change will happen. And we see that how the mother and father respond to stress and change has a um, 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 effect. Okay. There is a significant but small effect on education level, that as education level increases, child abuse rates go down. But I want to make this caveat on this because it's an important caveat. We see child abuse rates go down, but not necessarily domestic violence rates or relationship violence rates. Okay. Which then also can have a negative effect on the child. Okay. So when we talk about education, we see it reduce the propensity of child abuse, but not necessarily adult domestic violence or relationship violence. And then there's the view of being a parent. Okay. And this is where we need to look at the disconnect between attitude about being a parent and actual behavior. Okay. Because what we do look at as a view of being a parent is when a parent has a realistic view of themselves as a parent. Okay. I have worked with individuals where their children have been abused and they think they're the greatest parent in the world, that no one loves their child more than they do. But then when you look at their actual parenting behavior, there's a huge disconnect between their attitude about themselves being a parent and their actual behavior about being a parent. Okay. I have also seen where a parent has a very poor view about themselves being a parent. They're constantly stressed that they're the worst parent in the world, but their actual behaviors, they actually take care of the child, make sure the child's needs are met. So when we talk about view of being a parent, we first have to recognize, does the parent have a realistic view of themselves as a parent? If they do, and that realistic view actually meets their behaviors, we do find that parents who think that they're crappy parents and they actually behave as crappy parents, putting it in non-academic terms, they tend to put their child at higher risk of abuse. Okay. So when we look at this connection, when we talk about view of parent, it's the actual behaviors of the parent, not necessarily their attitude about being a parent. Okay. So those are some dynamics between mothers and fathers. Okay. Um, okay. So let's stop there because we'll leave cognitive development for later.